Hi, everyone. I am so thrilled and honored to be able to be here with my friend and inspiration, one of my great inspirations, Eric Ward. And today we're going to be in a conversation about anti-Semitism and racism, Black Lives Matter, the election. And I'm just so looking forward to us having this dialogue and hope that you learn a lot from it. I want to just first acknowledge that, and as we've been doing throughout all of the holidays, that this is an incredibly challenging, difficult time in the world with so much going on. And I want to acknowledge that Eric is joining us from Portland, where at the time of this interview, there are incredible issues with air quality and inability to go outside. And Eric, we just want to make sure you know that we're praying with you and for you and hoping that everyone in Portland is safe. So thank you for joining me today. So Eric, I've had the pleasure of learning with you and learning from you, but I know that not everyone here this afternoon has had that pleasure. And so I'm just wondering if you might speak a little bit about your work and your research, especially related to anti-Semitism and white nationalism in this incredible article that you wrote, Skin in the Game. And for those who have not yet read the article, I really want to encourage you to do so. So Eric, would you mind just sharing a little bit about your research and what's going on here?
Yeah. So Skin in the Game, an essay published by Political Research Associates and supported by an organization called Bend the Arc, a Jewish communal organization, was written and about 3.5 years ago and published just a little over 3 years ago. It's an essay, and in many ways it's a love letter. And love is a strange word, but I'll come back to it. Both to the Jewish community and to progressive and racial justice movements in the United States. It was a warning about the rise of white nationalism in America. That may not seem to be a big deal right now, Rabbi Herrmann, but if we go back 3.5 years ago, it was before Charlottesville. It was before Poway. It was before the targeting of Latinos in El Paso. It was before Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, or the murders that took place in Jersey City, in Brooklyn. When I wrote the essay, and I have to take folks back to that time now because it's hard to imagine, neither the progressive community or most of the Jewish community was actually talking about anti-Semitism. And in ways that anti-Semitism was being discussed, it revolved around conversations around what was happening in Europe, in places like France and the UK and in Hungary. It revolved around conversations around Israel, human rights, Palestinian territories in the Middle East. Most leaders within the Jewish community and non-Jewish leaders within the progressive and racial justice movements talked about anti-Semitism as a thing that had kind of passed in terms of an era. My essay argued that, in fact, anti-Semitism had never left, that it was being tapped into by social movements, one in particular, the white nationalist movement, that the white nationalist movement was distinct from white supremacy, a system of discrimination and prejudice, and was its own bona fide social movement on par to a civil rights movement or an environmental movement. And that white nationalist movement was fueled by a belief that it was in an existential war with the Jewish community, that there was an origin story to white nationalism. It wasn't just a set of behaviors, that it was a political ideology that sought to seize power and had built coalition with the Trump campaign in order to do so, and that it wanted to seize governing power because it wanted to engage in ethnic cleansing in order to create an all-white nation. And in short, that meant a nation free of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and Jews as well. That it was an inherently anti-Semitic organization and movement that was arising in our country. and that if we didn't come to terms with understanding the dynamics of anti-Semitism, if we didn't come together to oppose anti-Semitism, not just manifested by the white nationalist movement, but the underlying anti-Semitic, biased attitudes that were conscious and unconscious in our society, that we would find ourselves unable to harness the unity, to harness the necessary resources to confront a movement that sought to fundamentally to destroy democracy and to bring racial violence into our country. In that essay, I go into much more detail about how anti-Semitism functions, the nature of the white nationalist movement, and why social justice and racial justice organizations struggle around anti-Semitism. But more importantly, it was a warning. It was a warning to two communities that I had worked closely with over the years, and I felt that I had a duty to be clear about what was at stake in America. I think post-Charlottesville, Rabbi, none of us can now argue that folks don't understand that. People are seeing it, but my essay helps folks make sense of what's happening and hopefully provides a blueprint on how we can respond.
Thank you so much, Eric. One of the things that's so interesting about your article is how the anti-Semitism and the centrality of that in white nationalism is actually about the unwillingness to accept the success of the civil rights movement. Can you speak to that for a moment?
Certainly. People often say to me, isn't white nationalism and white supremacy the same thing, right? And I often respond, they're certainly interconnected, but conflating white supremacy, a system, with white nationalism, a social movement, is akin to comparing a Big Mac to a cow because they're both happen to be made out of beef, right? The problem with conflating them is, to go back to the Big Mac analogy, if you drop your Big Mac on the ground, you don't call a veterinarian, right? And my argument here is that we are really dealing with two phenomena at the same time. And I think it might be helpful if I explain a little bit. White supremacy is a historical form of systemic discrimination in our society. It has been with us for over 500 years. It predates the United States of America. It was created as a way of organizing society in the Americas. It was based off of three fundamental pillars. The first was that the stolen resources and genocide of Native people. The second was the forced labor, free labor, right, of African people who were held in captivity through a system known as chattel slavery. The third we don't often talk about is the control of women and sexuality in our society. Those were the three pillars that constructed white supremacy in our society. It was based off of one critical piece, though, that people had to come to believe, right, that whiteness was superior and blackness was inferior, and that everyone in between that was judged by their nearness to whiteness. White superiority was key. That is the system of white supremacy. It still persists today. But along came this 1960 civil rights movement, and it didn't just come along. I should be clear. Nothing has a hard beginning and a hard end. What I mean is that this 1960 civil rights movement changed and reshaped white supremacy in the United States. Previous to this 1960 civil rights movement, that actually, if you talk to folks, starts in the 1940s, right? Most of the major victories of the civil rights, of the 1960 civil rights movement, occur in the mid-1950s, right? To give you an idea. But this 1960 civil rights movement does something very significant. It breaks the back of white supremacy, and it breaks the back by actually out-organizing it, both morally and through political power. And when the 1960s civil rights movement concludes, we are left with a country where white supremacy is no longer the rule of law. It is de facto, meaning it is still with us. But previous to that 1960 civil rights movement, white supremacy was legal. It is how we decided economy, it's how we decided culture, it's how we decided politics in our society. It wasn't debated, it was just the way it was. After this 1960 civil rights movement, white supremacy becomes contested, right? And it opens up space for significant social change leading up to even the movement for Black lives that we witness today in the United States. If white supremacy is a system, though, white nationalism is a social movement that began, in fact, as a response to the victory of the civil rights movement. Again, I'll explain this a little bit. So here you have this Black-led civil rights movement. Black people are seen as inferior, right, within white supremacy. But yet these Black folks organize and they defeat white supremacy. Imagine for a second, you're an arch segregationist. You believe in Jim Crow. You believe in separate but equal. You don't have to convince yourself of it. You've been raised in it. How then do you come to terms with the fact that you just lost your most significant political defeat against people you see as inferior? Do you all of a sudden stop and say, well, I guess I was wrong. Black people must not be inferior after all. Well, while I wish that, we know that that's not what happens when it comes to people's worldviews. People are reluctant to give up their worldviews, their myths, even if they are harmful to the society and to themselves. But they had to come up with a reason. So borrowing from old anti-Semitic tropes like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was developed in Europe in the 1900s and used to spread anti-Semitism across Europe. Ironically enough, it was first produced and circulated by Russian Tsarist secret police in France because they were afraid of the spread of democracy. But the protocols eventually make their way back to the United States, and they're promoted significantly by Henry Ford, who was a wealthy industrialist at the time, who invented the mass production of the automobile. Henry Ford rescripted the protocols into a series of essays called The International Jew. He then published it in his newspapers, and they were spread and sold through his dealerships around the country. The protocols are a key piece of this puzzle. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion is a false document that purports to tell the story of a gathering of Jewish elders in a cemetery at midnight, right? And the story goes on to tell that these Jewish elders seek to take control of the world through the control of the economy, through the control of culture, through the control of banking systems, media, the list goes on. Depending on the version of the protocols that one comes across, there is something between 24 and 36 protocols. Now, again, this is a false narrative, but as we know, even false narratives in our society can have power. Where I sit right now in Oregon, we have incidences of armed vigilantes hunting in their communities for Antifa that they believe are setting forest fires in this community. It doesn't matter that law enforcement, both around the state and locally and federally, are saying it's simply not true. It doesn't matter that the media says it's not true. These folks believe it. And in the same way, those who came to believe the protocols believed that it answered the question to how they lost to Black people who they saw as inferior. For them, in short, you didn't lose to Black people. It was simply impossible. What they lost to was a Jewish conspiracy. And it is that blaming of Jews that has been the answer for the white nationalist movement, whether we are talking about immigration, whether we are talking about Muslim refugees, whether we are talking about women's rights. The blame around the expansion of inclusion in our society, of equality in our society, for white nationalists always falls at the foot of the Jews. For them, it's an existential war. They frame it as a war against good and evil. And we know in that type of othering that violence isn't far behind. In conclusion, if white supremacy is a system, white nationalism is a social movement. It's a response to the loss to the civil rights movement. But if white supremacy is about exploitation, white nationalism is about ethnic cleansing, about creating that all-white nation. And to do so means violence in our society, and it is violence that we have witnessed since Charlottesville in this country.
Thank you so much for that really helpful explanation, Eric. I'm wondering if in this connection between white nationalism and how central anti-Semitism is, how do we understand anti-Semitism wherever it lands? So for example, you know, even though clearly the violent kind of anti-Semitism, the people who want to kill Jews, you know, and see them as the root of the problem is coming from this white nationalist movement. And I can just say, frankly, as someone who is a Gen Xer, I only thought that people who hated Jews were skinheads in basements and, you know, suburbs. I had no idea that they were also people who might be my neighbor or look like me or talk like me or go to college with me. So that's a whole other conversation that maybe we can come back to.
Yes.
But I do want to talk about anti-Semitism writ large, because I think for a lot of Jews in America right now, we're feeling it everywhere, right? We're feeling like, oh, it's like, and sometimes what I've heard from people is that it hurts more when it comes from our friends, right? It hurts more when it's coming from people who are supposed to be our allies. So how are we supposed to understand, you know, anti-Semitism on the left or anti-Semitism in other spaces besides what we might consider this more fringe, although unfortunately powerful, movement of white nationalism?
Yes, I think it's a really important question. I think this is the key conversation that needs to happen amongst the Jewish community and non-Jewish communities. I think it needs to happen internal to the Jewish community. If I could help share at least some of my reflections and how I'm thinking about this. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying I have this part right. What I'm saying is these are the things that I'm also kind of wrestling with right now and trying to understand. Let me start first with a premise. Anti-Semitism, right, just like racism, isn't just a set of behaviors. And we can add homophobia to that, transphobia, right? We can list a number of forms of bigotry. And I want to place anti-Semitism within that for a second. And then I want to pull it out to talk about some of the uniqueness of anti-Semitism. But let's say all forms of bigotry are more than just a set of behaviors. It's not just what a person says. It's not simply what a person does. Yes, mass shootings, hate crimes are appalling and frightening, right? But imagine for a second that the only way we came to understand anti-Black racism in this society was only through the lens of police shootings of unarmed Black people, right? None of us would say that we have a strong, comprehensive understanding of anti-Black racism merely through that lens. And if we only judge the impact of anti-Black racism through the lens of unarmed police killings, we would be missing huge swaths of the impact of racism in healthcare and education and transportation. The list goes on. I think folks understand a little bit what I'm saying there. In the same way, I want to make the same argument. If that is how racism functions in our society, if that is how sexism functions in our society, so too does anti-Semitism function in the same way, right? It is not just all about skinheads. It's not all just about the white nationalist movement. It's not all about a small segment of Black Hebrew Israelites committed to anti-Semitic violence. It is not just about the statements of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. It means that anti-Semitism functions at a number of different levels. I believe that anti-Semitism is actually in the air we breathe, not literally, but metaphorically, meaning that there are conscious and unconscious ways that we engage in anti-Semitism, likely every day, right? How we perceive things. Now, there hasn't been a lot of study on that, but when you hear and you watch things that happen in our society, it becomes very clear. So I would say this. Point A, white nationalists don't bring anti-Semitism into our communities. They simply organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. The best response that we can build against white nationalists and others who seek to promote or organize anti-Semitism is addressing the anti-Semitism that exists at the unconscious bias level in our society. And that means having real conversations on anti-Semitism in our society, right? It means unpacking anti-Semitic dog whistles such as globalist, right? Zionist, the idea of Jews as wealthy, right? The idea of Jews as Marxist, the idea as Jews as being super clannish, the idea of Jews being cosmopolitan. All of these things, even if they're framed in what we would call philo-Semitism, they sound positive at the surface level, contain elements of anti-Semitism that are not only unhealthy for the Jewish community, they're unhealthy for all of our communities. The unique piece around anti-Semitism is that while it is a form of racism, let's be clear, it's not a religious form of bigotry. Anti-Semitism is a specific form of anti-Jewish bigotry that racialized Jews, that placed Jews as a racialized other, almost a supernatural race, right? Jews began to be the go-to, right? The holder of all anxieties and complexities within a society. You blamed the Jews. That is anti-Semitism, right? The other way that anti-Semitism functions besides racializing Jews is placing Jews as a buffer between the haves and the have-nots, right? This has functioned in other forms of anti-Jewish bigotry, but it's also particular to anti-Semitism today. And so if anti-Semitism is used to protect the haves from the have-nots, it is then not surprising that the have-nots are the most likely to reflect anti-Semitism, right? That is what anti-Semitism was made to do. And so I want to just parse this a little bit, Rabbi, just in a quick couple of minutes. I think it's critically important for us to understand, right, that there is no left or right anti-Semitism. There is no Republican or Democratic anti-Semitism. There is no conservative or liberal, right? There is merely anti-Semitism in our society, and how some social movements and individuals seek to tap into that anti-Semitism to provide and to build political power for other goals. It's crucial. You won't hear me talk about Black anti-Semitism in the same way that you don't hear me walking around talking about white anti-Semitism, right? Or Asian anti-Semitism. Yes, there are unique ways that anti-Semitism expresses itself in each of those communities that are unique to proximity to the Jewish community, right? Proximity to traditional forms of anti-Semitism in our society, right? And what type of media and stereotypes are being promoted within those communities. But at the end of the day, anti-Semitism, frighteningly enough, is universal. And it means and calls for a universal response. So we've seen anti-Semitism pop up in many different ways, right? We can talk about ways that it has popped up within racial justice organizations. We can talk about how it has popped up within progressive movements. We can talk about how it's popped up within the white nationalist movement, but there are differences. And one of the differences that we have to take into account is anti-Semitism just a byproduct of the normalization of anti-Semitism in our larger society, or is it being used to intentionally organize others? And in the places where it is intentionally being organized, right, to organize and build power, we need to take those movements very seriously and figure out how we intervene. Where it's popping up as a natural byproduct, right, of the large anti-Semitism in our society, it calls for a different type of engagement, right? We need to eschew some of the call-out culture, right, that many of us critique, right? That's been some of our own response, right, to folks who have stumbled into anti-Semitism, right? We seek to just shut them down, like close them off, say we won't work with them. And I'm not sure that's the type of value system we want to promote, right? So there's a difference. There's a difference between someone who is David Duke, right, or a Louis Farrakhan, and someone who is in our movement who simply says something anti-Semitic because they don't know better, or do something that's anti-Semitic because they've never actually been in a space where anti-Semitism has been discussed, right? They have no knowledge of how it functions in our society.
That's an incredibly helpful analysis. I think that that's really significant to see those distinctions. I mean, one question I have is, given the perceived privilege of Jews and also the conflation of Jews and whiteness, not saying that all Jews are white, but just that conflation, how do we get anti-Semitism be taken seriously when there's also so much hatred going on against, like, I think as we see, you know, the bigotry and the persecution of immigrants and Muslims and Black people and people of color much more easily seen, right, in our society. So I understand that anti-Semitism is not taking it seriously, but at the same time, if it's the root, if it's sort of a root cause or a central component of what's going on here, how do we get people to take it seriously? What do we do?
Self-interest matters, right? So I would offer a couple things quickly. I think one, for the Jewish community, you know, it's about leaning in and understanding. The Jewish community is going to find something out about progressive and racial justice movements that it probably knows, but is going to become reacquainted with, right? It's not like the Jewish community hasn't been part of these movements in very substantial ways, right? We are part of the same, you know, 21st century civil rights movement. But I will say this, you have to remember, when the LGBTQ community came to the civil rights movement in the 1980s and said, homophobia is real, it's a civil rights issue, and we need for you to take it seriously. I'd love to sit up here and say, oh my God, the civil rights movement said, of course, homophobia is a problem. Of course, come sit at our tables, right? Of course, how did we not realize this, right? That's a 30-minute sitcom that never really happened that way. I can tell you, right, knowing leaders within the LGBTQ community, that when they started to advocate around the importance of tackling homophobia, right, that folks weren't interested. Folks pushed back. You saw people's homophobia. One of the things we know about unconscious bias is that it's most likely to show itself when people feel under stress, right? When they feel challenged. And so, in fact, as LGBTQ leaders were pushing, people started to act in more homophobic ways, right? Because they were under pressure to deal with homophobia. And so that is a natural process, not only in progressive organizations, but in society as a whole. And I can tell you that happened with African Americans in the labor movement. It happened with immigrant rights organizations, right, within the progressive movement. The list goes on and on. So the first thing that has to happen is the Jewish community has to make a commitment to lean in, right? This is your home too. the 21st century civil rights movement in this country doesn't happen, right, without the Jewish community's participation. So you have a self-interest and a right to bring anti-Semitism forward. Second is this, there's a key piece here. Anti-Semitism doesn't just impact the Jewish community. That's a myth. Anti-Semitism has very real impacts on communities of color. If I had a whole hour, we could dive into those impacts, right? Because as I said, every form of racism in our society has a different function. And anti-Semitism has its own function, right? Which is to provide a escape valve, right, for inequality in our society by coming up with a community where those who are most vulnerable are allowed to take their frustrations out on. And that is the Jewish community. That is how anti-Semitism works. But the other function of it is to create doubt around democracy and around people's agency. Anti-Semitism denies that Black people have any legitimate grievances, that Muslims have any legitimate grievance, that immigrants have any legitimate grievances, that women have any legitimate grievances. Anti-Semitism says instead that Black people, immigrants, Muslims are merely puppets of a Jewish, puppet master who is pulling our strings. That is dangerous for vulnerable communities who are seeking to make change. If that doesn't help you who are non-Jewish to understand the importance of anti-Semitism, I would also say this. Yes, we understand, right, that the Jewish community was targeted in Pittsburgh. We also understand that Latinos were targeted in El Paso by an individual who walked into a Walmart to kill Latinos. We know Black church worshipers were targeted in South Carolina, in Charleston, in a church by an individual who was racist. We know that the Sikh community, who aren't even Muslims, right, were targeted in Wisconsin through the same similar violence around Islamophobia. But I want to tell folks something. Whether we're talking about Tree of Life, whether we're talking about Pittsburgh, whether we're talking about Charleston, Wisconsin, or El Paso, right? All violent acts by white nationalists, while all the communities were not Jewish, all four of those were driven by anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism provided the worldview that justified the violence targeting these communities of color. It is our self-interest to tackle anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism prevents us from aligning together at a critical time, and it prevents us from understanding that there is a other social movement on the terrain of America that is not looking for inclusion, but exclusion. Yeah. And anti-Semitism is its linchpin, and anti-Semitism, left unchecked, will prove its victory.
So powerful. I just want, Eric, for you to speak everywhere, at every moment, every time, bring this wisdom to so many communities, because it's so important. And we're almost out of time, but I would be remiss not to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement in general, because we've just witnessed this past summer, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others, we witnessed an uprising. There's been some sustaining of that, but of course there's the news media has moved on. So where do you see us right now with this challenge to our society and this movement and this wake-up call for racial justice and justice in general in our society? Are you optimistic? Are you cynical? Where are you, and what advice do you have for us as people who want to be part of this authentically as a Jewish community?
Yeah. So, interesting enough, I'm not cynical, and I actually don't hold despair in this moment. And for a large part due to Black Lives Matter's movement around this country, which is, right, the cornerstone of the 21st century civil rights movement in this country. I'm hopeful because You know, Martin Luther King Jr. during his entire lifetime, right? We're very ahistorical at times. And sometimes it's important to be historic and accurate. Martin Luther King Jr. in his lifetime never had the majority of America's support. Not once while he was alive did the majority of America agree with him. Not once during the heyday, right, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and its nonviolent direct action, did the majority of Americans support it. In fact, the majority of Americans critiqued it, right, and Martin Luther King. What's interesting is today we live in a society where more Americans and more white Americans support Black Lives Matter than ever supported Martin Luther King in his lifetime. So I want folks to hold that for a second. That is a sign of real progress in America. Not saying it's easy progress. I'm not one of these like 2-hour movies, everything gets summed up really nicely. That's not how the world works, and we should stop pretending. Those are movies. Movies are great, but movies aren't real life, right? But I will say to folks, I think we've won, right? I've seen it in like elementary school age kids, right, who are marching down the streets in suburbia chanting Black Lives Matters, majority white, right? I see it in some of the law enforcement officers who over the last 3 years have donned Black Lives Matters badges, willing to lose their jobs, right, to put on a Black Lives Matters pin or to fly it outside their police station, right? I see it in sports and in entertainment. We should be clear. Black Lives Matters was never a controversial statement. And now we see that most Americans agree that that is true, right? I will say that for the Jewish community, there's been a lot of challenge around Black Lives Matters. And that is the fact that many folks perceive Black Lives Matters to be anti-Semitic. And that has to do a little bit with the fact of the matter that a few years ago, there was a position paper that was released around Israel and Egypt, but predominantly focused on Israel. And for many folks, they decided at that point, because of that one position paper, it wasn't part of the Movement for Black Lives platform, it was just part of the position paper, that they wouldn't support Black Lives Matters at all. The thing is Black Lives Matters, the organization, has never passed any kind of position on Israel or hasn't said anything anti-Semitic, right? The thing to understand is Black Lives Matters isn't a single organization. It's not a single leader. It is not organization in the way that we understand it, right? It's not a Southern Poverty Law Center or an ADL where you call up the president, CEO. Black Lives Matters is made up literally of hundreds of thousands of organizations and individuals, sometimes loose networks of 5 people. And so what I would say is we need to be a little bit more complicated and understand that sometimes those who oppose inclusion will use mistakes and missteps in those moments to try to drive wedges against us, who will overplay what happened. The truth of the matter is that opinions on Israel within the Black Lives Matters movement is as diverse as possible, right? And there are lots of arguments and conversations. Those conversations are much more fruitful when the Jewish community is front and center, right? And one of the ways that the Jewish community can ensure that it's front and center is by supporting those Jews of color, particularly Black Jews, right, who are active in your communities, particularly young folks who are the bridge around this 21st century civil rights movement. The other thing we can do is to point out anti-Semitism when we see it, right? But to kind of, as I said before, avoid the call-out culture, right? The shutout, the shutdowns, right? That we sometimes see ourselves as victims to as well. There is a point of engagement here that is really critical, right? Most people in the progressive community, most people in America haven't had real conversations on anti-Semitism in decades, right? We have to give folks the chance to stretch their muscles on this issue. It's not only critical for the Jewish community, it's not only critical for the progressive community, but it is critical for America that as many of us as possible become experts on anti-Semitism. If we start shutting down those conversations because people are stumbling for words, stumbling for understanding, what we do is we drive folks back into corners rather than together. So what I would say is this: when we see moments of anti-Semitism coming out of the Black community or coming out of elements of Black Lives Matter, we should ask ourselves two really critical questions. One is, does it look like it's intentional anti-Semitism, and are folks trying to use that anti-Semitism to build their base? If so, we need to push back a little bit harder. But if not, we need to enter in conversation. The second is we need to stop pretending that we get to choose where we want to be and where we won't be based off of how people are acting. It is time to end purity politics everywhere. Imagine, Rabbi, that I refuse to go or have conversations with anyone or anything that was racist or I perceived to be racist, right? I wouldn't be talking probably to 3/4 of the Jewish community. I probably wouldn't be talking to 3/4 of this country. And what kind of organizing could I be doing without being in conversation, right? There are things that I find deeply offensive inside the Republican Party. There are things I find deeply offensive and racist as well within the Democratic Party. There are things the ACLU might do that I disagree with and find to be, hostile or, promoting racism at times. I suspect there are things in other conservative organizations I do as well. I don't flee those organizations. I don't flee conversations because they do something that is anti-Semitic. What I do is I try to bring accountability, transparency, and education to the moment, right? To open up space. This is not the time for silos. If we go into silos, we will die in our silos. And I don't mean physical death. What I mean is that we are in a moment in this country right now where the conversation is around, will we be an inclusive democracy or an authoritarian state that is grounded in exclusion, right? Inclusion is what takes us from the mountaintop, right, into the promised land. But we don't get into the promised land unless we all go together. And that means wrestling with one another deeply, because it is that important. Our children deserve it. And I'll finish with this one thing. I know now I'm talking a long time, but I do want to say this. George Floyd's daughter. I saw video about a month or two ago of his daughter on the shoulders of a family relative or family friend. And she was marching on the shoulders in Minnesota, and there were tons of people out. And I was thinking, here is a young girl whose father will never see her get married, who will never see her graduate from high school or college, never get a chance to teach her to drive, all the things that a parent gets to do with their daughter. He never gets that chance. She never gets her father back. And here she was, this young girl out there in this protest, looking around. And in the video, she says out loud, "My daddy changed the world." And I think about that in this moment. Her daddy did change the world. And that young girl deserves that world. She has earned the right to that world. And so do all other children. The thing is that she doesn't get that world unless we do our job right here, right now. As I've told folks over and over again, I've often wondered what I would have done in the 1960s civil rights movement. Many people listening to us right now may have wondered as well what they would have done. The truth is, whatever it is you would have done is what you are going to do when you get out of this service today. Make it count. Tomorrow starts today. This isn't just about us. It is about the generation that comes after us. We've won the fight for equality. The fight now is about making it real, taking it from aspiration to reality. And we don't just do it to make us feel good. We do it because that little girl and every child like her deserves it. And we are the ones who can give it to them if we move today. It's time for us to act.
Eric, amen, 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 amen. I cannot thank you enough for your incredible analysis, your commitment to the Jewish community and to fighting anti-Semitism and to making that a real issue for Americans, especially in the progressive spaces, to grapple with, for fighting white nationalism and raising that for all of us, and for inspiring us today and every day. And I just want to appreciate all of the work you do day in and day out to make this country a better place. And so much gratitude, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, and thank you for your leadership.